Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Pirronne Yousefzadeh. I'm Geva's Associate Artistic Director and Director of Engagement. My pronouns are she, her. I'm thrilled to have you joining us for the first in our Amplify series, which is a series of community conversations we're doing in conjunction with Recognition Radio, an audio play festival celebrating Black voices. Tonight, we're going to be talking about redlining and segregation here in Rochester, and I am thrilled to be joined by Dana Miller and Shane Wiegand. Before I tell you a bit about them, just a couple housekeeping things. If you don't mind turning off your video, if you are not one of the participants in the conversation, and then you can select in your view to hide non-video participants. That way you'll be able to focus your attention on Dana and Shane and all of the brilliant insights they'll be able to share. And if you require closed captioning, go to the bottom of the toolbar on Zoom, click closed caption, the arrow next to it, and then select show subtitle, and then you will have closed captioning throughout the conversation. I'm very honored and feel very privileged to be joined by Dana Miller and Shane Wiegand, and I will introduce them both to you and tell you a bit about them. Dana is the Deputy Commissioner of Neighborhood and Business Development for the City of Rochester. He previously served as an at-large member of the Rochester City Council for 12 years and was City Council Vice President for 4 years. Dana, thank you so much for joining us. And Shane Wiegand is a fourth grade teacher in the Rush-Henrietta School District and the co-lead of the Pathstone Foundation's Anti-Racist Curriculum Project. Shane is a board member of Connected Communities, Beechwood Neighborhood Coalition, and City Roots Community Land Trust. Welcome, Shane. Thanks for being here.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
To start, of course, we all may have varying levels of familiarity with this term and with its history. I would love for you to tell us a bit about the definition of redlining, what it means historically, and its particularly its impact during and after the Great Migration, and how we see it playing out in Rochester today. Shane, would you like to start?
I'd be happy to. So redlining is something I've had the chance to talk a whole lot about lately with our anti-racist curriculum project. And essentially it came out of the National Housing Act of 1934, signed into law by Franklin Roosevelt. And this Housing Act is one of the most consequential laws in our country's history. It literally built our suburbs, over $119 billion in federal subsidies. Over 35 million families benefited from these government loans, 98% of them being white folks, because written right into this law, which created the FHA mortgage, the 30-year loan, the low interest rate, it said right in the underwriting manual that if a neighborhood was to be stable and worthy of investment, all the properties must be occupied by the same social and racial classes, even going so far as to mandate that when a new builder builds a suburban development, like in Gates or in Webster or in Pittsford, that they must put racial covenant deed restrictions prohibiting the occupancy of those homes by anyone except by the race for which they're attended. So real estate agents were hired by the federal government to go through and rate neighborhoods to determine whether or not they were best green line neighborhoods or redlined, meaning hazardous. And you got a hazardous rating explicitly based on race. So a neighborhood like Cornhill, the 14608 zip code area, was 75% Black and therefore redlined. For my neighborhood in Beechwood, it was 2% Black, but that was enough for it to be redlined, meaning a neighborhood where Black folks would be steered and where no investment would be given, whereas the opportunity for home ownership in newer neighborhoods or nicer areas of the city, white folks had total access to kind of those homes. I could probably talk for another hour about redlining, but I'd love to hear what Dana Miller wants to add to that or anything else around that subject for sure.
Yes, thanks, Shane. That's a absolutely perfect description of redlining. And in the title card, as we were looking at that before this presentation started, you saw the actual map of Rochester from 1939, which was produced by the Federal Home Owners Loan Corporation, which defined those redlined areas. And so you know, although the term sounds like it has a lot of meaning to it, it really is as literal as it sounds. The areas, as Shane described them, that were red on the map were considered in a four category A, B, C, or D. They were considered D, which was hazardous. Now, that didn't necessarily mean hazardous to your health. What it meant was, in order for anyone to consider lending money for a mortgage in that area, it was considered hazardous to them in terms of being able to make a loan that would be reasonably expected to have been paid back. So those hazardous areas, if you have an opportunity to look at that map of Rochester, what you will notice is that the areas that were defined as hazardous in 1939 are still, unfortunately, the areas that are the worst off in terms of Rochester. More recently, you will have heard that area described as the crescent or the fatal crescent or some other very, very scary term that describes those same areas, primarily what we would have known as the 7th Ward or the area around Joseph and North Clinton, or the 3rd Ward, which we would have known now as Cornhill, and ironically is no longer considered that way because the urban renewal that took place in the late 1960s essentially eliminated almost all of the 3rd Ward, except for some of the very, very old houses that were in reasonable shape, but essentially knocked everything down and built brand new housing that was not to be, essentially not to be inhabited by the folks who had been displaced. So that urban renewal, you will actually hear a lot of people say it wasn't urban renewal, it was urban removal, because essentially all of the African American folks who lived in that area for so many years were removed as part of that urban renewal plan. So those areas that were redlined before are still areas that we are finding to be very challenged today. And whether that was a self-fulfilling prophecy or whether that was the result of actual activity taken by the government, perhaps can be debated. But I think we all understand that it's really something that happened because of specific decisions made by the government at that time.
And the way I think it plays out today is that it's no longer like explicitly racially based the way it was in the 30s to the late 60s. But when you look at like the reports the New York Federal Reserve has put out, or you look at the data that Empire Justice has done in the last few years, you can see that there's almost no credit access in those neighborhoods that are predominantly Black neighborhoods and that crescent, that there aren't any loans being given out for home ownership, or banks won't give loans for mortgages that are below $30,000 because the homes have so little value because it was designed that way. And I think it all kind of ties in.
Absolutely, and prevents folks from building wealth over generations, stunting that progress. Yeah. You referred to racial covenants, and I was wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more. It sounds like a thing of the past, though many are still in existence today, though perhaps rendered legally ineffective. Can you discuss what those are and where those restrictive or racial covenants can be found even today?
So a racial covenant is essentially a rule on a deed. So when you buy a house, you get a deed that proves you own that home. And there's rules for how far away your garage can be from your house or how far the lot lines are. But one of the most popular deeds nationally, and especially in Rochester, was a covenant that said no Black person or no person other than that of the Caucasian race can ever use, occupy, or own anything on this lot. And redlining was directly tied to it because you couldn't get investment to construct those homes without having that in many of these neighborhoods. So this summer, I recommend everyone look it up. The Yale Law School and City Roots Land Trust, and a bunch of my students and myself, we helped write that report that documents thousands of these across our community, almost all of Northwest Irondequoit, where Walter Wegman agreed to one of those homes, the founder of Wegmans, quite a bit of the whole area by the bay in East Irondequoit, along the lake in Webster, a number of neighborhoods in Penfield, Forest Hills in Parrington, Fairport, all throughout Pittsford, East Avenue Estates, Council Rock in Brighton, Meadowbrook neighborhood in Brighton, quite a bit in the area around Cobbs Hill, all throughout Elmdorf Avenue areas in the 19th Ward. So folks like Judge Reuben Davis, who later became our first Black judge, he writes about in his oral history for the Rochester Public Voices Project. He said he tried to buy a house on Elmdorf Ave, but there was a restriction in the deed that there was a covenant that said only no Black or Italian people could live there. And so the woman wouldn't sell to him. So he had to like go to the NAACP, and a white person bought the house for him and then sold it to him under the table. And that was like he describes it as a devious method that he and his friends at the NAACP would use at the time to fight back against those. But they were strong and very difficult to work through up through the late 60s.
And, to the point that I think was made earlier, what we have found is that many of those restrictive covenants still exist, because if houses haven't changed hands, then the deeds may still very well carry those covenants. As mentioned, they are no longer legally enforceable, but they may still exist. And the other thing that was, I think, a little bit interesting is that even in those restrictive covenants, and very often they were restrictive covenants that said the house could not be, as Shane said, occupied by anyone other than a person of the Caucasian race. It was also not unexpected to find that the covenant said the house could not be sold to anyone who was non-white or Italian or Jewish. So they were covenants that were actually used against even other people who we would now just say, well, they're white. And another thing that was often in the covenants, which again is kind of one of those interesting things of history, is the covenant would say the house cannot be occupied by any person who is non-Caucasian, but this is not to include any hired help that might be working in the house. So they didn't want to eliminate the possibility of having a maid or a butler or a chauffeur who could live there. They just wanted to make it clear that you couldn't live there and be a homeowner. And even there was an estate out in Brighton that was developed by Kodak specifically for Kodak executives, and that whole area contained the same racial covenant. So
it's the Meadowbrook neighborhood.
Yes, Meadowbrook, right.
It's fascinating about Meadowbrook is today their neighborhood they were run really through the ringer in the press this summer with this report, and they've got 65% now of their neighbors have signed on to have it taken out of their deed, because it's still on the deed, it's just not enforceable. But I'm white, but I can't imagine being a person of color and you sitting down to sign, my mortgage and seeing that and realizing, oh, all of my neighbors, many of whom signed on to their deed, the older folks, and agreed to this back in the day when it was still enforceable. Even school districts like Gates had these under their schools. County Supervisor Smith put these on hundreds of homes that he sold in tax foreclosure auctions. He went above and beyond and put those covenants in. So head of the Builders Association, head of the Bar Association, it wasn't like a few minor racist folks. It was the people in power.
Mm-hmm. And so even today, people can work to have these restrictive covenants removed from deeds. That's something that our viewers, if they're looking for ways to make positive change, that is something that can still be done.
You can go to the clerk and look up your home and see. If your home was built before 1948, there's a really good chance it has a covenant, quite a good chance. And you can see that. And we're trying to change the law in the state to make it easier so that you could very easily change your deed. Now you have to get a lawyer, and it can be kind of difficult to do it, but that's all in the report. We've been working with Clerk Romeo on some of that, and Harry Bronson. So we're hoping to see something good come out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between redlining and education. As you know, we were inspired to have this conversation in conjunction with the first play in Recognition Radio, Feeding Beatrice, where Luri and June, a married Black couple move to a predominantly white neighborhood to then discover that perhaps it may not be the picturesque fantasy they hoped it would be. And one of their motivations is to access a school system for the children that they hope to have in this new suburban home. So I'd be curious to hear you talk a little bit about the relationship between educational disparities and redlining, as well as the contrasts and challenges we see between the city of Rochester and some of the surrounding suburbs.
Well, we certainly have, and there's no question that we have challenges with the city school district. If we look at it from almost any measure, it tends to underperform the surrounding districts, and that's being kind. But I have seen in my neighborhood here, where I am right now in the 19th ward, I have seen family after family move in. There's a very nice house next door that is a smaller home that people tend to look at as a starter home. We find a couple, they get married, they move into the house, they live there for 2 years, they have a child, they live there for 2 more years, and then they say, well, gotta move. Why? Because, what we find is that for people who have a choice, they tend to look at this as five things. I can either find a private school, I can find a parochial school, I can find a charter school, I can decide to homeschool, or I have to move. Those are the only choices. People, for the most part, if they have any opportunity to go anywhere else, will not consider the city school district as a viable option for their children. It's very unfair. I went through the city school district. My sons went through the city school district. We all went on to college. We all have great, careers at this point, but things have changed dramatically, and it is very difficult for most parents to do the amount of work that is necessary to follow your child through the district, make sure they are in exactly the right school at the right time with the right teacher, with the right students surrounding them, with the right amount of support from home, with access to tools and resources. It's a lot of work. You can do it, but it's a lot of work, and many parents just throw up their hands and say, I'm not going to do that. I pay taxes. I should get the education for my children that's needed. So it's very difficult for people to stay. And as a person who is in charge of housing in the city, we have a very difficult time selling houses to middle and upper income families with children. We have a very difficult time getting them to buy houses in the city.
I think there's a real link to redlining, to why the schools are the way they are, because the way our country decides to do education is rooted in property taxes. And we know that our suburbs in the 30s and 40s, these were tiny little villages. Like Pittsford had less than 9,000 people back then. Like tiny little schools were out there. But by the 50s and 60s, towns like Pittsford grew from 9,000 to over 25,000 people. And they started building these huge high schools in the late 50s and 60s, all of these suburban towns. And they used it off of property taxes. And all of those homes were subsidized by the federal government. And they were exclusively for white families. So schools that are fully funded and that are these, big, nice new places, it's directly tied. And then because those neighborhoods were built and towns were built as white towns, it all kind of starts to connect, and not just white towns, but invested towns where you can get more loans, you can do things to invest. Whereas in those redline neighborhoods, which the city of Rochester, it had its own problem with segregated schools, inner ring versus outer ring schools. There were schools where it would be 99% white. I think school number 4 was one of those. Whereas like a school like school number 1 or some of these other schools in green lined and blue lined city neighborhoods, they were 100% white. In 62, Dr. Cooper and his friends at the NAACP, Judge Davis and some others, they sued in the Aiken case, the city school district. And it took over 10 years for the city school to decide to implement their integration plan. In 1966, while this was being debated, there was a protest with over 200 students outside of John Marshall High School, which is over in that Greece area, if I'm correct, in a Green Line neighborhood. And those students and their parents had all these signs, lynch type pictures, puppets, die, N-word, die, like we don't want blanks in our school. And just because there was a suspicion that people of color might have access through school reorganization or integration to John Marshall. At Charlotte High School, when Black youth started getting bused in 71, white youths would hide, and their parents along the Holy Sepulchre Cemetery and throw rocks and bricks at the buses, and students would get hurt and in trouble. I know James Beard was the head of the Black Student Union at Charlotte High School when it integrated, and he describes just horrific situations of what happened at that school and some of the interviews I've read with him. But his story wasn't unique. Quite a few folks had these issues. And then when people did make it out to the suburbs, you get folks like the Biases who moved to Irondequoit in search of better schools, and the Klan threw rocks through their living room windows, forcing them to sell their home and move. Or the Tollivers who moved to Brighton, their whole neighborhood banded together and went to the bank and bought the house out from under them before they tried to move in. They had to sue. The Primos tried to move to East Irondequoit, but their whole neighborhood signed a petition, over 100 signatures, saying they didn't want the pastor of the Episcopal Church downtown to be able to buy that home because he was going to host all-night drinking parties. Like, this is the specific language, but so you can see like the suburban areas really banded together to keep people out. And then those Green Line neighborhoods, they did the same things. And then school reorganization kind of ended after 72. So there's so much more you could talk about with all of that too. But I think there's some direct links between redlining and why some of our schools are predominantly Black, and some are predominantly white in Monroe County, and some invested in, some not. And same with the educational outcomes.
Absolutely. Related to this, I'm wondering if you can tell me and our viewers a little bit about the relationship between redlining and Rochester's overall economy, how this impacts entrepreneurship and small business owners, and how do we see the ramifications economically?
Let me just say a couple of things about about the economics, because this is a very important but very let me say just a little bit less understood factor here. And the point is that, as Shane pointed out, and as we've discussed, redlining really was a process of making sure that there were areas of the city where people couldn't buy a house. And when I was young, my family lived on Clarissa Street, and we lived there, until I was 2 years old. And then my parents decided they wanted to buy a house. They lived in an apartment. They wanted to buy a house. They went all over the area looking for a house to buy and were unable to find a house to buy. And ultimately were able to find a house off of Jefferson Avenue. Now, to most people who live in the Rochester area, if you say Jefferson Avenue right now, they think of it as a predominantly Black area, and it is. But in the early to mid to late 1950s, it was not. It was almost entirely white. And somehow my family was able to purchase a house off Jefferson Avenue, but they were not able to get a mortgage. There was no bank that would lend them money, even though at that point in time, my father had 2 jobs and was making a very reasonable income, but was not able to get a mortgage. And so there was a person in the neighborhood who bought houses and then would sell them on, over time, with payments to Black families that wanted to buy them, but at a higher than normal interest rate. And I remember the gentleman who used to come to our house on the first Saturday of every month and collect the money from my mom, because my dad was at work. But when you have this kind of situation, there are 2 things that happen. You don't really have the opportunity, because you're paying too much for the house. You don't have the opportunity to generate equity in the home. And the second thing is, as you're buying a house in an area that is not appreciating, then you have a problem. The house that my parents bought for $10,000 back in 1958 is worth today about $10,000. There's no equity in that home after all those years. because every other house, almost every other house on the street has now been demolished. So their house is an island around vacant lots, and it's virtually worthless. So if you don't build equity by buying and it doesn't matter what it is. I mean, everyone knows that if you have some investment, you expect it to appreciate. If I put money in the bank, I expect it to be worth more after a while. If I buy a share of stock, I expect it to be worth more. If I buy a house, I expect it to be worth more. If that doesn't happen, you create no equity. And that equity means you can't tap that equity to start a business, to send your children to college, to use for home repairs. If you have no equity in some asset that you own, then you're behind. If we look at the comparison of the net wealth of Black families versus white families, the difference is stark and very significant. And much of that goes right back to redlining.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that story of your family moving into Jefferson Avenue in 1958. Oh, not sure what that was. I think Susan, you might need to mute yourself there, Susan. All right. Yeah, I find that fascinating because like in 1958, I think that's the year Judge Davis bought his home on Elmdorf Avenue. And that was like, here we have a lawyer, and it's not a convent lease like maybe your parents got, or one of those kind of shady mortgages, which were very common here. Chicago, Ta-Nehisi Coates talks a lot about that in the case for reparations, but just an absolute denial of access to wealth. And then on that same Jefferson Avenue, you have urban renewal starting to happen in the 7th Ward. And so Jefferson Avenue, the white families that live there, their homes weren't worth anything anymore. So they decided, oh, we're going to chop our homes into 5, 6 apartments with 1 bathroom, 1 kitchen, and we're going to pack 5 or 6 families in these homes. One of the first Black librarians, Olga Edwards, is on the record describing, the place she lived on Jefferson Avenue and just watching these essential refugees from urban renewal in the 7th Ward come on over and just get packed into these homes, which again takes away wealth. People are paying way too much for rent because they're literally not allowed to live in other places. Alice Young in 57, she moved on to Millbank Street in the 19th Ward. And she was able to do it because Harper Sibley, a wealthy white woman from the Western Union Telegraph fortune, bought her a house and sold it to them under the table. And the Klan actively fought them in their neighborhood. So you have at the banks, at the individual level, at the governmental level, kind of each of these pieces, which is why, especially when you think about the county manager and legislator signing on to racial restrictive covenants and fully endorsing them, to me, it's just hard not to look at any of this and not agree with what Ta-Nehisi Coates has talked about with it. There's a real argument that some type of real reparation should be given to people of color. Because my grandfather, he bought his house right around 1958, and he bought it in Greece, and it quadrupled in value, more than quadrupled. He bought a bigger house, which also quadrupled in value, and sent my parents to college and me to college. When I crashed my car out of college, there was a fat check to help me pay for that when I didn't have much money. That's that cushion of wealth. And in our country, wealth is rooted in home ownership. But then the connection, I think, to businesses, for me serving on the board of Connected Communities here in the Beechwood neighborhood, it's been fascinating to see what kind of businesses work in a previously redlined neighborhood. And it's oftentimes, it's the kind of things that we don't always want in our neighborhood, or a ton of liquor stores in a neighborhood, or check cashing places, because people are underbanked in these neighborhoods. So you look at Goodman Plaza, you've got a plaza in our city that's not well taken care of, and that it's people use it. The person who owns it is making an absurd amount of money. He's not a person of color from the neighborhood. And those businesses, in my personal opinion, are not helping our neighborhood. And we should have Black-owned businesses there that are offering great services. But then when nobody owns a home around these places, and you don't have that extra wealth, and there's still lack of access to education and all these pieces, you don't have the market to have the kind of businesses that you have in Park Ave or Pittsford Plaza. And so it all, again, keeps connecting back to redlining, and then our failure, I think, to truly address these root causes, and then to do white people in the Great Depression, they got a massive government subsidy that allowed them to buy houses. We're in the same kind of state where Black people, I think Yale said in 2017, for every $100 in wealth white families have, Black families have only $5 in wealth. to me, that's a crisis like the Great Depression. Like drastic change has to be done. And I think federal, state, and local governments like ours have a direct responsibility. And I'm hopeful our RAISE Commission is going to come out with some recommendations that have some real radical approaches to trying to make a difference with that.
Absolutely. And I think another area where we see the effects of redlining are in, and in historically discriminatory housing practices, are in modern day health outcomes, including susceptibility to and outcomes with COVID-19. I read that 4 of the 5 zip codes with the most COVID cases per 100,000 residents here in Rochester were redlined. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the realities that the pandemic has laid bare surrounding the relationship between redlining and healthcare and health outcomes. Dana, would you like to start?
Sure. I'm not sure where to start.
I can get going for you, Dana.
Go ahead, Shane.
I think there's a direct connection to 1942 with the second Black doctor in Rochester, whose name was Anthony Jordan. Jordan Health today in his name. In 42, he did a massive study connected to Howard Cole's work around housing that found that housing was directly connected to African Americans in Rochester dying at 50% higher rates than white families. And the crisis at their time was tuberculosis. And African Americans were dying at 2.5 times the rate as white folks in the Monroe County area. This was all published in the D&C. And it said the headline, "Poor housing directly linked to health conditions." And meanwhile, you have places like the U of R that didn't let Black students into their medical program. Dr. Lunsford and Knox fought hard to get U of R to accept Black students. U of R had a segregated nursery, segregated separate and equal white and Black wards. I mean, all kinds of real direct issues with lack of health access. So it's not just the housing that led to that lack of access. 30% of those homes, Howard Coles found, didn't have running water. And in the 58 New York State Commission Against Discrimination, New York State found that in Rochester, in the 7th and 3rd wards, those red line neighborhoods, still 30% of homes didn't have running water. So that's just staggering. Where's the highest rates of lead, the highest rates of asthma? You look at the great work at Common Ground Health, you can see food deserts, it's those neighborhoods. Asthma, high blood pressure, COVID deaths at almost 3 times the rate for African Americans in our community. It's staggering and directly impacting us, I think, still today.
And it does go back to what we talked about a few minutes ago. For many of the families in the 40s and 50s, as they were moving into the area, and keep in mind that Rochester experienced an explosive growth in population at many points in time during its history, but not really anything like what they saw after after and during World War I and during World War II. And what we saw was that Rochester was a part of this great migration of people from the South, African American people who wanted to get away from Jim Crow, who wanted to get away from segregation, and moved to places like Rochester and Chicago and Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and Detroit. And so Rochester had its share of that. And the Black population from 1940 to 1950 tripled from 8,000 to more than 25,000. And these people who came here thinking that this was going to be a better place, that there would be jobs and there would be housing, got here only to find that it was a bit of a false promise. The overt racism wasn't really there, but the subliminal racism was still there. And you couldn't buy a house anywhere you wanted to. And so as Shane mentioned, what was happening is people would take a single family home and put 4 families in it or 5 families in it. And so when you have that situation, that does lead to the health outcomes that we've talked about. And we all know that lead paint was not outlawed in the United States until 1978. So any house that was built before 1978 absolutely has lead paint in it somewhere, under perhaps layers of latex or something else, but it does have lead paint. And we've worked very hard in the city to pass a law that eliminates lead paint. We have lead wipe inspections on every property that has a child less than 6 years old in it that is a rental property, and every property is inspected for lead. It has to be remediated, and it has to be remediated before you can rent the house. So, those kinds of health related impacts are very critical, but they are, as mentioned, tied, unfortunately, directly back to redlining.
Well, you started to segue to talking about policy, which we know is the the key to making systemic change and to putting anti-racist values into practice. And so, I would love to hear you talk a little bit more, Dana, about what the city is doing to address these inequities, and also what our viewers can do to advocate for change, and how as citizens we can get involved in addressing some of these issues that still affect Rochester and its communities today.
Okay, absolutely. I believe that we are working very hard as a city to try and help fix some of these challenges that were caused, um, not by anybody who's in office today, certainly, but by challenges that were caused years ago.
Mhm.
One of the main things that we have really focused a lot on is getting people who want to be homeowners to be homeowners. And that home ownership, as we've discussed, creates opportunities for wealth creation. It creates opportunities for generational wealth. It creates opportunities for people to have stable housing. So we work very hard. We have my housing department works very hard to make sure that people can buy homes. If somebody is interested in buying a home, we have home ownership training that they go through. Once they go through the training, then they have the opportunity to take advantage of the home buyer assistance program. The city provides $3,000 toward the purchase of a home. Generally, we work with different employers in the area. The U of R and some of the other larger employers will match that $3,000. And then depending on where you get your mortgage from, they, in many cases, will match it with an additional $3,000. So a person who's interested in buying a home in Rochester can get as much as $9,000 toward the closing costs of that home, closing costs and down payment assistance. So it's a huge advantage, because what we know is that because of this generational wealth, it's not at all uncommon for families who have lived in homes, as Shane described, where the value has quadrupled or gotten dramatically greater. It's not uncommon for families to give their children a loan when they are ready to buy a house. That almost never happens in the Black community because that wealth doesn't exist. The home buyer program helps try to close that gap. We also are working very hard with organizations like Habitat for Humanity and others through our land bank to take vacant lots that we have in the city and have new houses built that can then also be sold to people who are interested in living in the city. So having these new houses, and our old houses are great. My house that I'm sitting in right now was built in 1924. It's a beautiful house. We have some really, really great houses here in the 19th Ward, but an older home is not for everyone. Some people just want a new home. Some people want the expectation that there isn't going to be any major work that has to be done for some period of time. So by buying a brand new home in the city, you can typically avoid any major expenses for 10 to 15 years. So we're working very hard with organizations to build new homes in the city. And we also have a requirement, and people understand that there is a lot of development going on in our city right now. There are hundreds of housing units under construction right now, many of them in our downtown area. There's a project that will be approved within the next couple of days to build 160 units at the corner of Joseph and Clifford Avenue. These are going to be affordable housing units. So they're not for purchase, but they're new housing for folks. But we have a requirement that if a developer receives any assistance from the city at all, whether it's financial assistance, any kind of a tax agreement, that they have to make at least 20% of the units available for low-income people. And we define that as anybody who is at 60% or lower of the area-wide median income. So for a family of four, that's somewhere around $35,000 or so. So, you know, we're looking at ways to get people into safe, sustainable, affordable housing, and ideally housing that allows them to build wealth.
I think the city's doing some really great stuff with all of that work and the new development, making sure that's there. Warfield Square in the Beechwood neighborhood has a lot of affordable housing units. Low-income housing tax credits are kind of came out of the '84 tax reform bill. They're kind of the primary way that affordable housing gets built. But I think it's really important to recognize that while some people are being helped, I mean, we have a short of almost 28,000 affordable housing units in our community. Almost 9,000 evictions are being processed in our community each year in our courts. So there's still like what's being done, while important, doesn't come close to meeting the need that in large part was created from these policies in the past and the lack of action our entire community, because Rochester can't solve this on its own. I think we really have to look at a regional approach. So I think some of the work Kara Finnegan has done at U of R with her book Striving in Common looks at education, looks at housing, and how all these things need to come together with health and like that collective impact. I know our MAPI is doing some great work around some of that, but it's also going to take incredible political will and a real change in mindset from our community, which is where I think things like the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project, some of the work that the superintendents and BOCES and Qs are doing around creating curriculum where kids learn this actual history of redlining and of civil rights in Rochester. I really believe that no one should be like me. I graduated from Webster, never had a Black teacher, and I sat next to maybe 2 students of color my entire time in school. And it wasn't until I was well into being an adult that it occurred to me that, oh, I went to a segregated school. Like, it didn't even occur to me. And then I saw the recent EdBuild report from 2020 that found that Penfield and Rochester, their boundary is the #1 most segregating school district in the entire United States, and Brighton is #6. That's not the kind of community that I want to be proud to be a part of. So the city alone can't solve it. It has to truly be a community effort. And I think part of that is going to have to come from teaching kids about the people like Alice Young, or it sounds like your parents, Dana, or these different families that decided to say no and to push back, but then to also look at public housing in Rochester. Norton Village was built, Ramona Park, Seth Green Apartments. These were whites only apartment complexes that were subsidized by the government to be affordable housing in the 40s and 50s. It wasn't until 52 that public housing got built for Black folks with the Hanover houses. Howard Coles and others fought hard for that. And it was supposed to be built in the all-white 22nd Ward, but Councilman Nagel was his name. He responded, he had the groundbreaking ceremony right by, I think it's Ben Franklin High School, and a mob of hundreds of white 22nd Ward residents, I think I have the ward number right, it could be wrong. They mobbed, it's in the paper, they rioted at Ben Franklin High School when the state representatives came, demanding that it not be built in their neighborhood because of the undesirable tenants that might come in. The next day, it was published in the paper, it was going to get moved into the 7th Ward, that Clifford Joseph area, which continues to be a place in those red line neighborhoods where affordable housing keeps getting built. Because in those nicer green line neighborhoods like North Winton, Browncroft, Cobbs Hill, people don't want that kind of stuff in those neighborhoods, and they have a lot more power because of home ownership, right? And we continue to have these issues where the redlining plays out in different ways, but the power imbalance stays the same, and it continues to be help, but nowhere near what has to happen. And there's so much justification when you look at what white folks in our community got. Even Chatham Gardens, built in the 7th Ward, it was 50% white, 50% Black. But 5 years in, almost all the white people had moved out and bought homes in the suburbs. So it was meant for upper middle class African Americans and white folks who just didn't have enough to put that down payment on their home in the suburbs. So they built Chatham Gardens, and Hardrick McMillan was his name. He was a Black man interviewed living in Chatham Gardens about what had happened there after the first 5 years. And he says, yeah, some of my friends who I worked with, I think he worked at Xerox, one of those, a larger company, middle-class type job. And he goes, yeah, they saved up some money thanks to public housing. And then they bought a big house in the suburbs. but I'm Black. Where am I supposed to go? That's like a quote from the DNC in 1967. So you're like, what do we do? Aside from sweeping large-scale policy, continuing the work that's been done, but then really advocating for change at that federal level too, and the state level. It's going to have to happen in those places as well.
Absolutely. And before I ask my last question, just a friendly reminder to our viewers that if you have questions for Shane and Dana, you can pop those in the chat. You've mentioned a few, and if you could also just share resources where folks can learn more. If this was their first ever conversation about redlining, tonight was their crash course, and they're curious to learn more, any recommendations for those resources?
I would highly recommend a book. It's called The Color of Law. And Shane, who's the author of that?
Richard Rothstein. We brought him to Rochester a couple years ago. He's fantastic. Yes.
Right. But The Color of Law really goes into great detail about how this redlining took place, what the impact of it was, how it has had an impact on communities over time. I think it's a very compelling read for anyone who really wants to understand how this happened, why it happened, and what the results of it were.
And piggyback on top of that, Yamada Taylor's Race for Profit. Her book came out just a year or so ago, and it looks at how after the Fair Housing Act, predatory inclusion kind of came into play with the way that now that Black folks had access to federal lending, they were preyed upon by local developers and real estate agents buying homes that they really couldn't afford, and that had really big issues with them, like all the electrical or the roof would need to be done, and then they'd get evicted and the builder would get their whole FHA mortgage insurance. You saw similar things happen with like Liz McGriff's story from the tenant union a few years back, and she does an amazing job looking at that and getting some great policy changes. I also put a link in the chat that has a link to my lecture that's specific to the local history. And there's a database of primary sources with all kinds of interviews, the documents from those commissions that I've referenced throughout, and those oral history resources, where you can kind of hear firsthand about those stories and read the specific laws and policies. And you can also look at all the neighborhoods that had those racial covenants that we found so far, and dig into that piece quite a bit as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. We had a question earlier in the chat. Was the creation of the inner loop connected to redlining?
It absolutely was.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, right in the underwriting manual for the FHA National Housing Act 1934, it actually said high-speed traffic arteries should be used to separate undesirable or inharmonious racial groups. And so to get that urban renewal money that built 490 and destroyed Clarissa Street, where you grew up, Shep's Paradise, Pithot, all these amazing Black businesses, the Stevens grocery store. I mean, these places got knocked down as urban renewal came through, and 850 Black families were displaced in that third ward. And those businesses and the bits of wealth that were able to be accumulated, it all tied in for that highway to get built, and it kind of served as a moat to the city. And you look at other cities, you have the same sort of thing going on, and you can see it directly linked to, if you want those federal funds, you got to follow these underwriting manual guidelines. And so putting your highways in those places makes a lot of sense.
So there's a financial incentive to actually further that segregation.
Absolutely. And then you look at where the inner loop got filled in, it wasn't the boundary between the 7th Ward, that Joseph Avenue area in downtown. It was between the white East Ave, Park Ave kind of area. And I'm sure there are a lot of great reasons for why, smarter people than I have to say, but you look at that and you're like, it's super interesting that that is that place. And the place that it was filled in was a red line neighborhood, actually. That was where Savannah Street was, where quite a bit of a Black community was there that also got pushed out through urban renewal. Strong Museum is actually on the site of vacant land that used to be homes where African Americans lived, and they got it super cheap. And public housing was supposed to be built there, and instead the museum snatched it up several years later because the development had fallen through. So there's just so many links and layers in this history, and so much more to this story.
Absolutely. We got another question here in the chat, a request to please describe ESL's role in the history of redlining in Rochester.
So ESNL Bank, Eastman Savings and Loan, was created around 1920, 1921. Their stated mission was to help employees get home ownership. Kodak didn't hire Black people. I think James Laval, Olympic silver medalist, he was in Hitler's games in the 30s. He was the first Black employee at Kodak. And then later you had Sam Dent, Dr. Knox, and then Helen and Walter Cooper. And then it wasn't really until Fight's work in the 60s that you really saw a shift at Kodak. And so right in there, essentially, it's for white people, the bank. But in the early 1920s, Dana mentioned Meadowbrook and Kodak right by the high school. It saw 371 homes. They describe on their website, carefully planned. You saw they all had racial covenants. ES&L was created to finance those mortgages for their employees for that whites-only neighborhood. Same with Coda Vista, the Bonespiel track, the Rand track. So there's a direct link between that Kodak side. I've gotten to share some of this work with ES&L, and they're supporting the curriculum project. And it's been really interesting to see them take a look. I think 1958, if their CEO, Fahim Massoud, is, I think what he shared with me, the research is that in 58, Dr. Cooper and his wife Helen were the first Black family, and they were Kodak employees, to get a mortgage from ES&L Bank to buy their home in Henrietta. That's 1958.
And they were started in 1920. So, there's a fairly substantial amount of time between when they were founded, as Shane said, primarily to make sure that Kodak workers could buy homes. And, for 38 years, they didn't have any employees of color really that they would be willing to lend any money to. So, the good thing is that, and Fahim is a good friend of mine. They are working very hard now. They have an ESL charitable foundation that is doing great work in the community to help compensate for some of that activity that took place in the early years. But nevertheless, they were clearly, hundreds, if not thousands of families that perhaps missed out on the opportunity to buy homes.
Absolutely. I think too, it's important to mention that the other banks were very much involved. M&T, these all the other, Lincoln was one of the biggest banks in town. These were banks where they did not give they didn't give mortgages, not just the redlining mortgages, any private mortgage to people of color. Milliman, Stubbs, all these different guys that ran these banks. It kind of goes right through there. Oh, the other thing about ES&L, they signed the first GI mortgage in 1944. Douglas Foxell was their CEO, and there's a picture of him in the paper in 44, the first GI mortgage to a white family. All of those GI loans denied to African Americans in our community. So ESL, their money and the wealth that they were able to acquire in the bank, in part was due to FHA and GI mortgages, which were subsidized through redlining and that Housing Act. And the Kodakari newspaper reports every year, how many FHA mortgages they did, and they did millions of dollars worth of them, all the way up through the 50s. And I think it's important to note that they participated and were complicit for sure, aside from directly denying. But there's definitely great things happening today. I think that's very positive. But again, it's still, we're nowhere near enough to what we have to do as well.
Sure. In the time we have remaining, I did want to ask about the students who've been involved in the work you've been doing, Shane, and how they've been impacted, and how also you've been impacted by their involvement in that work with you.
It's really changed my life, my students' questions. We've trained almost 500 teachers in the last 2 years in this story. And these teachers, thousands of kids are hearing about redlining and covenants in their town, about the blackface shows that almost every school district hosted at their school auditoriums, and learning that explicit racist curriculum was taught in these schools. And today we're trying to do something that's the opposite and put people like Dr. Cooper and Connie Mitchell in front of these kids so they can be inspired by those stories for change. And one of the stories that's been the most impacting for me and really drives me on a long day like today to keep sharing this sort of work is the story of 3 of my girls from several years back who, after hearing these stories, came to me after the unit and said, we see racist policies in Rush-Henrietta. We don't have any Black teachers. We have to do something about it. And I was like, well, what do you think we should do? And they're like, let's go to the principal right now. And I was like, we could, I've got tenure. I was like, but what did Howard Coles do? Right? What did Alice Young do? And they're like, well, they got friends together and they researched it. They had their demands, and So the girls came up at lunch every day with a couple of friends and they researched it. We had 550 white teachers and 11 black teachers. Henrietta has more black teachers than all of the East Side suburbs combined. But still, 11 black teachers, they did the math. Their chance of having a black teacher by graduation is pretty much impossible. So they met with the principal, wrote him the cutest note in the world. It's like, hey, can we talk to you about a problem we're noticing and have lunch with you? And they sat down with him, and that poor guy, they hit him hard. And then they talked to the superintendents and they talked to the school board. And I'm proud to share that in our district, thanks to some great leadership, they've listened to the activism of these kids. And we have 3 historically Black colleges in Atlanta that we've partnered with to create a feeder pattern and active policy changes in the way hiring is done, so that those students have the teacher who looks like them that they truly deserve by the time they graduated. And if that had been me voicing it, it wouldn't have mattered. But you get a couple of 9-year-old girls with a passion who have their facts straight and they have the legacy of Alice Young and Dr. Cooper behind them, how you can't stop them. Imagine what, 8th graders and 12th graders and, like the work of teen empowerment. I've done a lot of work with the youth history ambassadors who have been investigating Clarissa Street. And if you haven't seen their documentary that they did yet this summer, it is phenomenal. And it talks about the Black Broadway of Rochester on Clarissa Street and interviews with youth. Those same youths are helping us with our trainings for teachers to talk about the issues they see related to race, their experiences with the protest movement this summer, and how teachers can support youth to be activists and makers of change. And I think that opportunity, done in the context of the great work that's been done in the past, the people who are doing it today, it's hard to imagine that these kids aren't going to be able to really solve it. Instead of just saying, we're colorblind, the problems are over. That's what I remember as a kid. That's not going to help. We have to look at our past, we have to face it, and we have to move forward with that knowledge. And that's been keeping me going.
Yeah, I just want to add one quick thing too, because it's very, very encouraging to hear that the kids are not looking at this as, oh, well, that was a problem a long time ago and it's not a problem anymore. I just want, for anybody out there who was thinking, yeah, that was a big deal back in the 40s and the 50s, but it's not like that anymore. I just want everybody to stop and think about a couple of numbers. The city of Rochester right now is 42% Black and 44% white. The towns of Pittsburgh, Penfield, and Pirronne are 93% white and 2% Black. Even the most, what most people would consider to be the most racially diverse suburb, which is Henrietta, is 84% white and 7% Black. So we have not seen much movement in this change of people feeling comfortable, having the opportunities, and being, able and willing to move from areas that are, less diverse to areas that are more diverse, or vice versa. We're not really seeing that movement, and it's not because it's illegal anymore. It's because it just isn't happening enough. So we're not done. It's not over.
We just got one more question. This will be our last question before we wrap up. If you have the statistic on hand for the percentage of Blacks in Brighton.
I do not.
It is 86% white and 1.3% African American in Brighton, according to Wikipedia.
Thank you.
Remember, Brighton is number 6 in the country for segregated school district boundary lines. So they're not so good. There's some more diversity, I think, with the Asian population maybe in Brighton. But when it comes to economics for people of color, not so much.
Well, there's a lot of work to do. And I know that in this difficult time and this particularly dreary day, I am going to hold on to the hope that your story of your students filled my heart with. The great work continues. I want to thank once again Shane Wiegand and Dana Miller for joining us for the first conversation in our Amplify series. Please visit recognition-radio.com to learn more about and register for upcoming engagement programs, and to also purchase access to our fantastic lineup of audio plays. I also want to give a friendly reminder that Sunday is the last day for early voting in Monroe County, and Election Day is this coming Tuesday, November 3rd. You can check out the schedule for early voting and polling locations at monroecounty.gov. And if you plan to mail in your ballot, please plan now to drop it off in person, since you might be cutting it a little bit too close for the very overtaxed Postal Service. If you're outside of Rochester and joining us, you can visit iwillvote.com if you need more information for voting in your city/state. Once again, Dana and Shane, thank you so much. To everyone who joined us, thank you for joining us in this virtual space. Stay safe and have a good night.
Thank you so much for
joining us. Thank you so much, everybody out there. It's great to see so many people interested in learning more about this. Thank you.
Thank you.